Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. It's time once again to take your questions, and they are all coming from Twitter this week. Our first one is from Steve Shaw, who asks, did the government agree to give Quebec a fixed percentage of the House of Commons seats? Close, but no. So the Bloc had a supply day motion this last week, which was about ensuring that they don't lose seats during the upcoming redistribution as Elections Canada has currently planned. And the government did agree to that. In fact, only a handful of Conservatives voted against it. And it wasn't even the whole parties. So that's somewhat interesting to note. But the government has agreed with this motion, and the word has been that Dominic LeBlanc's office has been looking at ways to make this happen and what that means in terms of readjusting the formula that Elections Canada uses and so on. So there will likely be some kind of a legislative fix coming before too long. But it does seem to be the will of the government that Quebec doesn't lose a seat in the next redistribution. But that's slightly different than the fixed percentage, which had been a thing that they'd been asking for previously. But in this particular case, it's just that they don't lose a seat. Our next question comes from Mrs. White, who asks, maybe a long shot, but with politicians now concerned about disinformation, are there rules with respect to spreading disinformation in the House of Commons and the Senate? If yes, what are the repercussions? If not, how, if possible, could it change? So short answer is there are no rules around it because parliamentary privilege ensures that MPs and senators can say whatever they want. And that includes protection against legal repercussions like slander laws. The longer answer is that the rules as they exist make the assumption that all MPs are always and senators are always telling the truth because this is an august chamber, and how it's somewhat unfathomable in the gentlemanly nature of what Parliament is supposed to be that they would do so, and that's why there's rules around calling out if a member is not being honest, which forces the other side, usually the government, to go around and find ways around that. Now, there is my understanding is that if someone wants to make an issue out of something, they can bring a motion to debate, which essentially says that this statement or whatever that someone made is false, incorrect, misleading, whatever, and then they can have the House deal with it in that regard. But this is kind of something that nobody ever does, likely because they're concerned it would be weaponized against them at some future point when they make an honest mistake about something. So that's kind of the, I guess, quandary that we're in, because the way the rules in Canada are structured is that the speaker can't necessarily call out when he or she knows someone is deliberately wrong in their statements, because we haven't given the speaker that authority. They do have it in other places. Australia, I do believe, empowers their speaker to do so, but we didn't give the speaker those particular kinds of policing powers in Canada. So MPs could amend the standing orders to give those kinds of powers to the speaker. It would be a very fraught process, but that's something that's out there as a possibility. It is something that is concerning because we have seen disinformation being used a lot more in debate now than ever used to be. And I'm using disinformation deliberately as opposed to misinformation. But it's also incumbent on the other side to call it out as well. And the current government does not like to do that, particularly when false statements are being made or attributed to them. And instead, they'll try and use a happy talking point instead and try and deflect or whatnot. Rarely do they ever actually correct the record, and that's a problem in and of itself. This government has taken the maxim that if you're explaining, you're losing to heart, so they never explain anything. And thus they let a lot of this stuff go unchallenged and be wrong on the record, which I personally think is a problem. But this is not something necessarily that House rules need to fix. It's just a question of the government needing to actually have the backbone to correct stuff when it's being used against them in disinformation and so on. Conspiracy theories are another big one. And they need to get over this thing about not explaining, because this is just letting it go unchallenged. But again, this is not necessarily a rules problem. It's a government behavior problem in response to it. So as regard to consequences, the ultimate consequence is or should be having them voted out, because they are treating the House and Canadians with callous disregard for using these kinds of tactics. That again gets complicated by the fact that we have a media who likes to both sides things rather than actually calling out when stuff is being deliberately wrong or using disinformation, which is a whole other discussion. But to your point, yeah, there are no consequences in the House rules, and I don't know that there necessarily should be, but there should be more pushback in any case. Our final question comes from Fiona Kenny, who asks, why is Pierre Poilievre the front runner for Conservative leader? He's widely acknowledged as one of the most unlikable Conservative members of Parliament, or is it just the beginning of another weird battle for leadership? I think it is the beginning of another weird battle. Pierre Poilievre has the popularity he does and the notoriety he does because he's basically a fighter. But a kind of rhetorical fighter, I guess. A lot of his fans, and this is kind of going in with this whole populist mentality, is that they see him as someone who's a scrapper. He likes to pick fights, and he likes to basically say, it's the whole saying anything to own the libs. And that's kind of led him down some very strange paths and down some strange and troubling logic problems, and just, the willingness to say whatever, no matter that it's completely untrue, just because he thinks it'll score points. And there is a constituency within the party that thinks that that's great, that he's being tough and he's fighting the Liberals and he's giving them a black eye, which, I don't necessarily see that being the case, but this is what they perceive, and that's why they kind of lap up what he's doing. And, it is what it is. I think the party needs to have a serious bit of soul searching if they think this is the direction that they want to go and that they think will win them future elections, because I'm not sure that that's really the tactic, and most professional pollsters don't seem to think that that's the tactic either, because that's not where the accessible votes are. But this is kind of where the discourse is going when it comes to populism, and particularly right-wing populism. There was an American election where it was the whole thing about take him seriously but not literally, was a whole thing. And this is kind of feeding into that same notion. And that's, I think, is kind of troubling, but it's up to conservative members to also come to the conclusion that this is troubling and this is not a direction that we think we should be going down, because this is not going to get us votes and win us an election. But they need to kind of come to that of their own accord. So we'll see where that goes. I think he's not going to be unchallenged in this leadership, and I think there's going to be some very interesting dynamics the more people we see coming into it. But we've got until September to watch this play out, so we'll see. And that's everything for this week. Thank you for all of your questions. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.